I'm going to keep mine on here, Rob. So, Rob, when we were at Search for Common Ground, I mean, oftentimes people just say Search. You led two national consensus process, one on healthcare, the other one on U.S. Muslims relations. And then I always love this when you tell these stories about what led you from an advocacy role before Search for Common Ground, working on Capitol Hill as an advocate, to leading these national consensus process.
Well, there's many versions of this, some of which are true. But the main thing for me is, actually, I'm a mediator at heart, and what Rudy could probably tell you, I was in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. I actually went there thinking I would be a mediator. But along the way, having been through the tumultuous years we were at Cornell, I got very involved in social causes, got very concerned about the issue of poverty in America and racial issues. And I came to Washington, I became an advocate. And I thought in the beginning that morality itself, my religion, everything else required me to be a progressive and a liberal. In my point of view, I just had equated both of them. And then as I came to Washington and eventually formed relationships with people from across the political spectrum, I began to see the decency of people of all different walks of life and different points of view. I began to see that many of them honestly wanted to solve problems. And I couldn't live with really the cognitive dissonance of seeing people of decency who wanted to solve problems, who saw the world differently than I did, and actually had ideas that were really worth considering. Sometimes I'd be in conversations with people that, were just so intelligent and they said things I never had thought of. And of course, that's normal. None of us has complete knowledge. And we get so invested in our own point of view that eventually I had to break away from my liberal advocacy beginnings to embrace the different worldviews, Philip, that you and I share. And once you sort of get to that, it's hard to have it go away. So again, I've talked to Philip about how I often see good people in bad systems, people fighting and arguing. It has seemed to me there was so much unnecessary rivalry and debate and argument when underneath it all, most people wanted the same things. And so that was kind of a revelation for me as I worked my way out of jobs on Capitol Hill, working on bipartisan basis in the House and the Senate, and then running this progressive advocacy group. I ended up debating two people as a liberal advocate. They were conservatives. Two of those people have now served on the Convergence Board of Trustees because we became friends. And so I guess one of the things I'll say, and one of the themes of tonight, is that the power of relationships, to me, is extraordinarily important. And it's not only the key to the work that we're doing now at Convergence, but it was the key for me to open my eyes to the decency of other people and to develop a really healthy respect for people who perhaps saw the world differently than I did, but I thought really had something of value to add.
Nice, Rob. Nice. I always love that. It's good people and bad systems and processes. And, it was fun to watch you with those two projects at Search for Common Ground that you pulled together. And then you went on to Convergence. You've led probably at least a dozen different consensus processes on issues that people would be surprised that you could find any kind of common ground. So what are the fundamental processes you employ, and what makes this process distinctive?
Great. And maybe, Jen, maybe you could put up a link while I'm talking to the Convergence website where you can all get this information. Look, fundamentally, and this is kind of a breakthrough, I think, that we created, there are a lot of people who have some discussions in Washington across differences. Most likely some think tank will sponsor an event, and they bring in someone on the left to the right, and they have a debate, and then they write up the proceedings about where they differ. The fundamentals of our approach is to first understand that there's probably a shared problem people want to solve. And so that's really the first step. And as you think about your own advocacy, and I may want to make some suggestions or offer some thoughts later based on what I heard last week, think about what's the shared goal that people want to address. So we did, for instance, a project on economic mobility. We had the Chamber of Commerce, we had the AFL-CIO, we had advocacy groups left and right, we had community colleges. And what we found is everybody agreed that people should be able to realize the American dream. They just disagreed how to do it. Some people thought more government intervention, some people thought work, some people thought benefits, some thought the higher minimum wage, some thought the corporate sector wasn't pulling its weight, but rarely did they talk to each other. So But they did agree that people who work full-time ought to be out of poverty, and that people ought to have a future that might lead them to be as well off or better off than their parents. So it's important then to identify a shared goal. Then it's really important to frame it in a way that's appealing to different points of view. And our theory of change, just to start with, is this, that all different perspectives may have something of value to add to a conversation. It may not be of equal value. We're not saying everyone's equivalent, but that we'll have better answers if people from across a wide spectrum are presenting their views, and the creative tension of their different points of view push people to higher levels of thinking and higher solutions. So that's sort of our theory of how to get to better answers. So then it's important, if you want to involve, labor and business on economic mobility, if you want to involve teachers unions and charter schools on the future of K through 12 education, which we've done, if you want to solve obesity and diabetes, you need food companies and consumer advocates to talk to each other. Frame that issue in a way that everyone feels invited in. So when we started economic mobility, we thought at first we'd call it economic inequality. And we found that for some people, particularly those more on the right, inequality was conflated in their minds with income redistribution. So we didn't want to have to get over that hurdle. We found the term mobility or opportunity, and that brought people to the table. So identify a problem, frame it in a way that's inviting for people, and then ask yourself the question, who is it, if they could only come to the table and talk to each other, could help forge solutions that are stronger and more durable and wiser because of their different points of view? And who is it, if they could only work together as a result of that, could actually move the dial on the issues? So we identify those people. We don't always do a perfect job getting to the table. Philip remembers when I was at Search, we had a project, we had Madeleine Albright, we had former Republican members of Congress, we had the head of American Petroleum Institute, we had the leader of the Southern Baptist Convention Religious Liberties Commission, we had the former director of AIPAC, we had author Stephen Covey, all come to a table because they had the collective intelligence to try to deal with U.S.-Muslim relations issues. So that's the next step, and I'm prolonging this answer a little bit. So it's find an issue, frame it up so it's inviting, figure out who needs to talk to whom to make a difference, and then you need to facilitate a debate, a dialogue amongst them, not a debate, where you don't start with arguing positions. You talk about your underlying interests, your concerns, your values, and you build personal relationships amongst them. There's a whole lot of steps we take to build trust with us and to build trust amongst the people. And we often do it 2 days at a time. Many times people travel from around the country and they break bread together. And one very famous story, we had invited a group in to deal with incarceration and the rates of recidivism and reentry. And controversially, we invited a representative of private prisons. I'm guessing a lot of you probably have opinions about private prisons, as did I. Well, it was so bad that we're told that one of the other participants hid the nameplate of the private prison guy the first day of the meetings. Really didn't think that person ought to be at the table. But we'd met with this person, and we knew that that person was somebody who contributed all that experience. So, of course, that night at dinner, after they'd shunned each other, we sat them together. And eventually, after they were sort of back to back, not looking at each other, we got them talking. And the guy from private prisons basically said, look, I'm proud of what I do. If you want private prisons to do a better job preparing people not to recidivate and to be ready to leave prison, write the contracts at the state level that pay us to do that, and we will perform the contract. We have no interest in profiteering on the backs of people in prison. And in fact, we've diversified our business to have a whole reentry business so that we can take care of people in communities. And he won the guy over. This guy was an academic who kind of swore he'd never visit a private prison, but 2 months later, he went to Tennessee with his daughter on a college visit and visited the private prison to learn about what they did. So very important then to build relationships of trust in the room so people can at least listen to each other. Doesn't mean they necessarily agree. So that's the last pieces of the process, is to engage in dialogue over time, create an arc of issues that will help lead to solutions. We usually come up with shared principles first to evaluate the ideas by, and it's often easier to agree on principles and tougher to get to the details. And then you move people toward agreements on ideas. And in our case, we hold them their feet to the fire to create a shared plan of action, what they're going to do with the ideas they come up with. So that's the overall process.
Well, Rob, I love it. I mean, there's so much here, in having been privy to some of the backstory, particularly on the U.S. Muslim with Tom Dunn. I mean, that's a great story there. You could tell, just how Tom Dunn created that,
Yep.
sparked that one. You want to mention that one briefly? Because I just love this human interest story here.
Well, there's so many angles to it, Tom, but I'll just mention quickly. This is a fellow who's now going on 81. He was a Navy SEAL in the Vietnam era, having gone from studying for the priesthood into the Navy SEALs. And he had an experience on the beaches of Vietnam, which forever made him a peacemaker. But Tom, after seeing a successful project we ran on healthcare back then, which for those of you who may not be aware, it's been accredited with laying the groundwork for passage of the Affordable Care Act by bringing together the same people who had opposed the Clinton plan to work with people who favored it. But Tom said, we've got to do something about U.S. Muslim relations, Rob. And I looked at him and I said, what the hell are you talking about? I don't know the first thing about it. He says, Rob, it's the process. So this former Navy SEAL led us into a dialogue that ended up involving the same people that I just mentioned, Madeleine Albright and others. But Philip, maybe is there some element I'm missing that you wanted to bring out?
No, it just how, I mean, for me, that was an interesting story, just how you created a whole process that then led to a report that built up relationships. And then that report, ended up informing President Obama at the time.
Yeah, it turned out we did it. And we took it to the McCain campaign, which is when it came out, and it was very warmly received. We took the two Republican former members of Congress, one quite well known, Vin Weber of Minnesota. And I went with them to the McCain campaign. They said, we love this. When we're elected, we're going to implement it. And it turned out, having Dennis Ross and Madeleine Albright on our table, that Obama's people looked at this report. And a few months later, I was sitting with a person who's heading sort of Obama's relationship with the larger Muslim world. He had a dog-eared copy of our report. He said, I love these. We're implementing idea after idea. This is a great report. You got any more ideas? Of course, I didn't. But it was nice to see that ideas we had to create economic ties with Muslim countries, appoint special diplomats like eventually Richard Holbrooke and others to go into problem areas. Whole series of ideas, left to right, got implemented during the Obama years. And we would like to think that had John McCain been elected, a whole series of ideas would have been implemented as well, because we had bipartisan support for it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And Rob, I mean, you've led so many examples. I mean, you've mentioned incarceration, U.S. Muslim, K through 12. What are some other examples of success? Because what I'm really looking at here is to break out of this win-lose Democrat-Republican. I mean, what's the range of successful works that you've done? And then what are some approaches that didn't prove so successful?
Okay. Well, let me just say this. The main thing to remember about us is that it's the process, and we think it can be applied anywhere. Given if you do your homework and I will mention some conditions where I don't think you can use this process. So we have had success getting food companies and consumer groups to work together in what one foundation officer called a life-changing experience, to hear an exchange between consumer advocates and big food companies. In fact, I'll digress a second to tell a story about that. We're about to pull together a very tense meeting of people in the consumer world and some big food companies. And about a week before the meeting, the leading voice from the consumer world put out kind of an op-ed that said, not so much in relation to our meeting, but said basically, we're on the side of the public good. The food companies really are not. They have to answer to their shareholders and stockholders. And while we certainly should talk to them and be decent, let's not go too deep in talking to them, because they don't have shared interests with us. Well, my inbox lit up with howls of protests from the food industry people I had invited to come to this. And they said, is he really coming? Does he really mean that? And what the heck, what are you getting us into? So I called him up and he said, yeah, I'm going to show up. And we went around the room. And we started, this is how we always start. And I'd urge you, as you think about when you want to solve problems, we asked people to speak from the heart about who they were and why they were concerned about obesity and diabetes. And if you closed your eyes, you wouldn't have known who was from the food industry and who was a consumer advocate. And what this guy heard, this advocate, was food industry person after food industry person, Campbell's Soup, Burger King, you name it, fast food stores, other retailers, supermarkets, and so on. They basically said this. They said, we can't stand that there's an obesity epidemic in this country. We have children that we do not want to have diabetes or obesity. We have one person talked about a relative losing a limb to diabetes. We also have employees. We don't want our healthcare costs driven up by this. So we don't have an interest in people being obese and being fat and so on, but we can't unilaterally disarm from products that make money, and we have shareholders to listen to. So we think the conversation needs to be about how do we create more market demand for healthier diets? And if you will help us do that, then we will try to take some risks to get there. The consumer groups, I think, were moved by that, but they also responded to say, well, if you will suspend your double bacon cheeseburger commercials in the inner city areas that we're working on so that we have a chance to infiltrate and get the messages out, that would really help. So that became the basis of dialogue. And as I mentioned before, we only had enough money for one meeting. This was very early on in Convergence. It's hard to raise money for peace building, at least in the domestic policy area, probably internationally as well. And we had a woman from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation there, which is the leading foundation in the country working on those issues, and we barely got her to come. And when we left the meeting, she came up to me and she said, Rob, do you understand what happened in the room after listening to this? And I said, I think I do, why don't you tell me? She said it was a once in a lifetime experience. I literally have goosebumps in my arms and throughout my body. I've never heard the level of dialogue to be so frank and so open. Right? Someone needs to mute.
Oh, you did not?
Yeah, if everyone could check, make sure your lines are muted.
In any event, the punchline is that not only was she, having been in dozens of these dialogues before, so impressed with the level of depth we got to and the earnest sharing that to a nonprofit director's heart, she delivered $350,000 a year for 2 years to support the dialogue. So that's another example of the kinds of things we worked on. We've worked on, as I mentioned, we've worked on long-term care, which is the non-health related social services that elderly and disabled people need. And there's been a big debate how to finance it. Is it more government? Is it more private insurance? And we found an elegant solution to that. And we've worked on all the issues that Philip and I have already covered: incarceration, mobility, U.S.-Pakistan relations, and more.
Thanks, Rob. This is such a breath of fresh air with everything going on in the political scene right now, but we'll come back to that in a second. So where are situations where the approach may not be so successful?
Yeah, well, so here's a few things. And if you can't get to a shared goal or shared moral goal, you can't do it. So like people say to me, do I need to sit down with white supremacists and negotiate the differences? I said, no, you not need to have a shared goal. And I hypothesized that if I was consulted by Martin Luther King in 1961 or something, and would I advise them to sit down with George Wallace or white segregationists to discuss integration? No, because there wasn't a shared goal. They might eventually come to some shared goals, but I would also say people like King and Mandela, I respect greatly, because even though they became advocates, they did it in a way that did not demonize other people. They met people where they were. They respected the fact that those people only knew what they knew then, and they didn't want to alienate them long for the future. But if you don't have a shared goal, then it's very hard to sit down. A second point, and I don't mean to be political about this, is that you have to be truthful, and you should be able to rely on evidence and facts. I mean, there may be opinions and so on, but there has to be some modicum of at least keeping your word, or else the negotiation is a house of cards. So if you don't have people with integrity at the table, you can't do it. The other thing is that sometimes this process, although we've learned ways to do it very rapidly, sometimes this process takes time. And there may be certain urgencies where people just need to act, like in light of this pandemic. Convergence right now is looking at some angles of issues where we think we can help after this first round of emergency to deal with economic recovery and workforce issues, particularly potentially healthcare issues. But in a short-term emergency, you've got to hope that you have galvanizing leaders who can bring people together and move quickly. And so there isn't always time to do this process. So it can collapse for a lot of reasons. And when I did it, Search for Common Ground on HIV/AIDS collapsed because, frankly, we couldn't get over the personal animosity of two of the leading stakeholders who disagreed, and we couldn't handle that. But most of the time, what I want to say to you is that it's possible to create relationships of deep trust amongst people who used to be adversaries. They may not agree, but they end up really usually liking each other. I say that familiarity breeds affection most of the time, not contempt. We have a famous story of a woman who, in our education project, who heads a very conservative foundation, used to blame teachers' unions for the problem of why our schools were failing. And of course, we put her at a table with the vice president of the NEA. And at the last meeting, they got up and they basically professed to the entire group that they loved each other. Then they went out on speaking engagements together on the areas of common ground they found, even though they continued to disagree. So I know this may sound a little Pollyannish, but it's possible to have people who really are hungry to be connected. People really prefer, I think, not to be in conflict, at least most people. So it's possible to create those relationships, and that's the ultimate grist by which people can open their hearts. And there's a lot of, sorry, I'm digressing now, but there's social science that the formation of trusting relationships literally changes neurologically who we are and opens our minds and hearts in ways, allows us to listen differently than if we don't have a connection to a person that runs deep. And that's very much what has to be done.
Nice, Rob. There's so much depth here. I just love it. Okay, so you focus on some big national issues, but how might the principles and approaches apply elsewhere, even in people's everyday lives here in this group?
Yeah, I think there's hundreds of ways it can. We just work statewide in California, but you can work everywhere. And I think if you take, the basic fundamentals of, giving people the benefit of the doubt, understanding that you have shared values and interests, and looking for that, looking to hear, opening yourself to hearing different points of view, that all of you, whether you're, I used to say that I'm not sure I can help you with the debates around your Thanksgiving tables. Maybe not. Those are tough, and even I get sucked into them. But by and large, whether it's a community dispute or, and I want to get into this a little, Philip, if we can. Last week, I heard people talking about after that, the index you heard about, how do we reduce levels of guns and nuclear weapons? There's lots of ways to enter that conversation where you either believe that, we're right, they're wrong, let's rally our troops and let's, defeat them by majority rule or getting more power. There's another way, which is to simply engage with people. So long as you can find a shared goal, you can apply it anywhere. You can apply it to a local neighborhood dispute. You can apply it to a family dispute. But then it's a matter of engaging with respect, of listening, of hearing what's underneath the positions people take, which positions are inherently rigid. The interest you have can be satisfied by any number of different positions and solutions. And it's sort of staying mindful that if you take that attitude, you can go very far on a wide range of problems in a wide range of settings.
Nice, Rob.